Hello, I'm Stacey Runde, a graduate student in the Department of Nutrition and Dietetics. Thanks for your interest in my project. Parents exhibit certain mealtime behaviors and attitudes that have been thought to predict or diminish feeding problems like selective eating in children. The purpose of this study was to find the relationship between mealtime behaviors of children and their parents and the probability of feeding problems like selectivity. Parents from a Facebook group in Northeast Iowa, the Cedar Valley Mamas group, were invited to participate in a survey where they were asked to complete the Behavioral Pediatric Feeding Assessment Scale, or BPFAS, which is an independently validated scale used to determine the probability of child feeding problems. The tool gives scores for parent and child behavior during mealtimes, known as behavior scores, and also scores for whether the parent feels those behaviors are problematic, known as problem scores. Higher behavior or problem scores mean a higher probability of feeding problems. Following the BPFAS, participants were asked to provide background information about household income, parental level of education, field of work, whether the parent believed their child was selective, and whether the child was diagnosed with mental health or developmental disorders. These questions were important to the study because previous research had focused on narrower populations like low-income households, parents to autistic children, or parents with a low level of education. Scores from the BPFAS were calculated to show a high probability or low probability of child feeding problems. These scores were then used to try to identify themes within parents or children who scored with a high or low probability. The most significant finding from this study was that parents are very good judges of whether or not their children are selective. In all BPFAS scores and all predictors of feeding problems, it was found that parents who regarded their children as selective eaters were likely to have a child who scored that way on the BPFAS. In practice, clinicians should feel comfortable asking parents about their child's eating habits as a quick way to screen for feeding problems. Other significant findings were actually insignificant results. It was found that parent income had no relationship to probability of feeding problems. Previous research primarily looked at low-income parents and concluded that lower-income households have a higher likelihood of feeding problems. However, this was not supported by these new findings. On a clinical level, dietitians and other care providers need to be aware that the probability of feeding problems does not affect only low-income families, and it should be standard practice to screen children for feeding problems across all income levels. Similarly, this new research found no relationship between parent level of education or field of work in probability of feeding problems, again supporting clinicians screening children from all backgrounds for feeding problems. Finally, past research had pointed to sensory processing difficulties often seen in autistic children as a cause for feeding problems. Recently, research expanded to include any child with sensory problems, not only autistic children. However, this new study explored children with any mental health or developmental disability. The results were extremely mixed. Children without any mental health or developmental disabilities scored higher than their counterparts with mental health or developmental disabilities in both the high probability and low probability of feeding problems groups. What this reestablishes is that any child, regardless of neurotype, can show signs of feeding problems. And that finding bolsters the idea that clinicians should extend education about feeding problems to all types of children. So, in short, this study challenged the idea that parents can influence their child's selective eating with certain selectivity-inducing or diminishing behaviors because of the similarities in feeding problems that were found across all types of parents and children. It would be interesting for future research to study guilt associated with selective eating and look for themes with selective eating across previously noted parental or child differences correlated with guilt. Clinical practice should expand to include all parents and children in educational opportunities that will help families appropriately feed their children. Parents should also be assured that they are likely not to blame for childhood feeding problems, but that they hold great insight into their child's eating habits and should feel comfortable speaking to their clinician if they suspect feeding problems in their child. Thanks again for your interest in this project, and please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions or comments. My email is linked in the video description.